We always want to welcome all of you who are joining us for Bible study this morning, and we thank you for tuning in, and we hope this lesson will be an encouragement to you and to others. I have to say again, thanks to Rob Espinoza. I put a note in the newsletter, but he did a really good job with the sermon last Sunday, focusing on a seasonal thing about Thanksgiving. Rob, I just thought it was a terrific lesson. I appreciate that very much. Have you ever had a really bad day? Don't tell me it was yesterday watching the Buckeyes. We've had a few of those watching the Brownies this year too. But have you ever had a really, really bad day that might be ranked right up there with one of the most calamitous that you could think of? I think we probably all have, some maybe more than others. And one of my wife's good friends shared a story recently, probably about a week or two ago, about one of her extraordinary days. And I use that term extraordinary as a euphemism to describe an exceptionally calamitous day. I'll tell you about her story here, and it is true. She visited with us for Thanksgiving along with Gail Wheeler, with Jeannie and I and Mark, and we talked about the story a little bit then, but I knew about it for about 10 days or so, and I haven't stopped chuckling about it, and it's not, I don't mean that in the sense that I enjoy her calamity, but it's just one of these things that you think, how could you make this up? So after she awakened one morning, she headed to the garage to get her car to transport her for some of her day's events. She lives in an adorable little house. She's a single woman, and it has an attached garage, just one of those kind of midway between Youngstown and Boardman, and kind of like Keith and Linda Street, where there's a lot of different architecture as you go down the street. It's a cute little house. It's just perfect for her. But she headed for her garage, and when she turned on her ignition key in the car, the dashboard on her car lit up like a pinball machine. Now, her car is a GM model of some kind, and it's a Ford? No, it isn't. All right, I'll let my brother-in-law overrule me. But anyway, it's a new car, only about 6 months old. And she wasn't sure what to do. It had never done that before when she turned on the ignition. But she had enough savvy, she's a pretty savvy lady. She popped the hood, and she was surprised to see a bagel laying on the top of her engine parts. And that was a clue to her that something wasn't right, especially since she hadn't been eating bagels at the house because of a gluten-free diet. So a call to the auto dealership brought in a tow truck that took her vehicle in for some troubleshooting session. You know how that goes. And an initial diagnostic indicated that chipmunks had made mincemeat of her wiring system in her new car. And since it was going to take quite some time to do a thorough examination of what the damage that was done, and she would need some temporary wheels. But because of COVID, the dealership was currently not offering loaners. However, she discovered that her auto insurance would pay for a rental. So the dealer provided a courtesy shuttle to take her to Enterprise to get her rental. And when she began at Enterprise to do the paperwork for the rental car, she realized that her driver's license has just expired. It snuck up on her and she didn't realize it. On her birthday, which was the middle of the month. So, no driver's license, no car rental. The shuttle driver offered to take her to the BMV to renew her license. And there she was told, and I've had some experience here when we came back from out west, I had something similar with an expired driver's license. But she was told there that in order to renew an expired driver's license, that she would need her birth certificate. She thought her birth certificate was at her mom's house. The shuttle driver took her to her mother's house, who wasn't home. She opened the door with a key, which she had, but she didn't realize that her parents had changed the alarm code, the security code on the alarm. So promptly the police arrived. The birth certificate was nowhere to be found. The shuttle driver then took her to the courthouse to get a certified replacement for her expired birth certificate so that she could take care of her expired driver's license. And when she got there, a sign noted that masks were required, and she didn't have one on her, and they didn't provide any. So she had to go nearby to a drugstore to get a mask. And then the shuttle driver took her back to the BMV after taking care of things at the courthouse, where she went inside to take care of all of it, and there were now 23 people waiting in line ahead of her. That's what you call a rude awakening. It's the kind of day that you wished you wouldn't have gotten up in the morning. When the shuttle driver took her back to Enterprise to get her rental, he expressed to her that it was like a day he'd never experienced before. He had never in all of his life as a shuttle driver gone to such an extent. The only good news from the whole ordeal that day was that the dealer's bill for the wiring, which early on was topping $1,000, was adjusted downward significantly when Jeannie's friend decided, well, I've got a $500 deductible, so I may as well use it. And when the Geico adjuster got involved, all of a sudden $1,000 became $300. So that was a good thing that came out of it. If you have a story that tops that one, I'd like to hear it. One that was not nearly so circuitous, but one that always I remember when I think about calamitous days was an elder for the church in Ashtabula when I was a young preacher. We'd been friends for a long time, and this again is a true story. I've told you this one before. He and his wife were going down to visit relatives in Kentucky by way of West Virginia. Betty, you and Beverly know that route. And so I don't know, somewhere along the line, they needed to stop and get some gasoline or push water, as Jeannie's dad would call it. And they were traveling in a camper van. And I don't know if it was because Pauline was tired from the previous day or what, but anyway, she was in the back of the van sleeping. And so my friend Hezzy pulled in to get gas, to gas up the van. I don't know what he did afterwards. I didn't hear all of that part of it. He might have gone in to go to the restroom, which you would normally do. But he came right back out and got in the car and drove down the interstate. And he went 100 miles before he realized that his wife had gotten out of the back of the van to go in to use the restroom. Now, the dilemma for me would have been, should I even go back? How do you get over that? Oh boy, you ever get lost? I get mad when I have to go 5 miles back to make up what I missed the road in the first place. But 100 miles and turn around and go back, and all the way you got to be thinking, she is going to be so mad. Now for today's sermon. Several weeks ago, our midweek Bible group on Wednesday nights, we did some reflecting on a passage that is found in 1 Corinthians 16 and verses 5 through 9. Would you turn there in your Bibles, please? 1 Corinthians 16 verses 5 through 9. Paul wrote this letter to the church at Corinth with the anticipation of visiting them, but he wrote it from Ephesus. And here's what he says in those few verses. 1 Corinthians 16, 5 and following. But I shall come to you after I go through Macedonia, for I am going through Macedonia, and perhaps I shall stay with you, or even spend the winter, that you may send me on my way wherever I may go. For I do not wish to see you now just in passing, for I hope to remain with you for some time, if the Lord permits. But I shall remain in Ephesus until Pentecost. Here's what I want you to listen to. For a wide door for effective service has opened to me. And then he adds, and there are many adversaries. Our midweek Bible group has been addressing some of the hard sayings of Paul, and that which makes this passage, 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 9, fall into this category of being a hard saying is because of the tension that describes. Here we have Paul talking about, I'm going to linger at Ephesus because a wide door for effective service has been opened to me. But then he adds that expression, for there are many adversaries, for we have many adversaries. And these two thoughts, when you harness them together, might be rightfully, we might be inclined to describe them as being mutually exclusive. That's a term that just kind of says they don't really belong together. If a wide door is open for effective service, we might normally conclude that the adversaries were few, if any. Or stated differently, the presence of many adversaries would seem to point to a closed door. Why should I stay in Ephesus? There are so many adversaries. I want to stay in Ephesus because the fields are so ripe and everybody's listening and nobody's opposing. No, but here it's a combination of both. Here Paul contends that the door is open wide in spite of the numerous adversaries. And I've been thinking about how important a lesson this is for ministry in particular. I could have really stood a good, strong lesson on this early on in my ministry. It's not, though, an important lesson for ministry in particular, but also for life in general. So unlike what we read in the New Testament times, Christians today, I think, and I don't mean to be too harsh in making this charge, but I think many Christians today have been enticed by a kind of siren song. This 21st century spiritual ditty or song communicates a sweet sounding melody that we're often quick to buy into. We like what we're hearing and we want to hear it. And it conveys the notion or the idea that if we walk in the light, everything will be light and everything will be all right. Right now. I know God has the capacity to turn bad things into good, and we'll get our reward sometimes for a calamitous life and the future hereafter. But I'm talking about how some have taken their journey with Jesus and they have embellished it with ideas that really aren't that biblical when you think about it. It is absolutely true that God always takes care of his faithful ones. But he does not surround us by a protective bubble. When you begin reading in the book of Acts, when you get to Acts 7 and verse 54, it tells us about the stoning of Stephen. Why didn't God protect him? Acts chapter 8, verse 1 tells us of the persecutorial scattering of the early saints. They came to be disciples, and as a result of it, the persecutions drove them from their homes. Doesn't sound like much of a nice reward, much less a protective bubble. All it says except the apostles. For some reason they were given protection, but then we read in Acts chapter 12 and verse 1 and following, the mistreatment of the apostles, the beheading of James. James was a wonderful apostle, but he died early in life because his head was cut off by those who were antagonistic to the cause of Christ. And it tells us about the imprisonment of Peter, and we could read on and on. So my point here is to say that as we journey in life trying to please the Lord, which I hope we're all doing as we journey, the seas will not always be calm, and the paths will not always be easy and pleasant. I suspect you've noticed that. The unvarnished truth is that more often than not, life presents us with just the opposite. We want calm seas, but sometimes they're rough. We want pleasant paths, but sometimes they're odious, they're difficult, they're hard. Paul, who wrote these words in 1 Corinthians 16, hurdled more obstacles than we can ever imagine. Open your Bibles to 2 Corinthians 12, and actually 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 23. Paul says, he sounds like he's behaving improperly here, and that it could be interpreted as almost that he's boasting. But you have to understand the setting there, that there were ones who were accusing Paul of not being a real apostle. And it's true, he wasn't one of the 12, but he was every bit an apostle nonetheless, called by God. And he's getting agitated that others are questioning his authority as an apostle and his legitimacy. So he says these words in verse 23 and following. Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if I am insane. In other words, I shouldn't brag like this, but so am I. I more so. In far more labors, far more imprisonments, beaten times without number. Often I have been in danger of death. 5 times I have received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. I'm sorry about this cough. Jeannie, throw me a cough drop if you would, dear. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've spent in the deep ocean. I have been on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers at sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, and hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, there is the daily pressure upon me for concern for all of the churches. Hey, I have been preaching for 45 years, and my biography doesn't include any of this stuff. Well, I've been through some hard things, but to this level? So Paul had hurdled so many obstacles, and Paul also confronted more opposition than we could ever fathom. Along my journey, there's been several people who just did not like me, and some of them I just couldn't do anything to please them. I think that's probably more the norm than it is the exception. I tried to do good and to be good and behave myself, but there are some people you're just never going to please. But to have opposition like this, Paul, remember Jesus warned the apostles early on. He talked about the coming of ravenous wolves who would really be false prophets masquerading in sheep's clothing. And Paul sure understood what Jesus was talking about, because he talked about in 1 Corinthians 15:32, he said, I fought with the wild beast at Ephesus. He's not talking about lions in the sense of four-legged creatures. He's talking about people who were antagonistic to the gospel. In Acts chapter 20 and verse 29, before his departure, Paul spoke real candidly with the elders of the Ephesian church, and he said, after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And in Philippians chapter 3, he wrote and he said, beware of the dogs. One of the most famous signs you can buy anywhere, beware of the dogs. That's a scripture that Paul wrote, and it wasn't really about four-legged creatures. It was about people who opposed the cause of Christ. In 2 Timothy 4 and verse 17, Paul said, I was delivered out of the lion's mouth. Some people say, well, that was talking about the Colosseum and, being made sport of, fed to the lions. No, Paul's talking there, the lions or the dogs or the savage wolves or the wolves in sheep's clothing, they're all the same creature. And then he does personalize it from time to time. Paul doesn't do a lot of this name calling, if that's what you call it. But he says in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 14, Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. And then he goes on to add that the Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Let me hasten here to the punchline for the sake of my voice. And it's good to give you a shorter sermon every once in a while. Rob's was not real long last Sunday, and I thought, that's kind of refreshing. Kind of made me resolve to be, keep it simple, Siverd, Warren. Bumps in the road, or whatever you want to call them, are not obstacles to be avoided at all cost. They are frequently stepping stones to growing stronger. We're engaged in a process, and those of you on the committee, you may have to be real candid with your preacher candidate sometimes, because the preacher candidate may be coming in and saying, okay, I want to hear all the positives and all the negatives, and so we want to downplay the negatives, and we hope he'll downplay the negatives, and there are some everywhere. But it's maybe this passage that we ought to think about. Sometimes, if I want to go for a job interview and they say, oh, come on, the water's great, the seas are so calm, it's so lush, the flowers are beautiful, and you're not going to have any problem here. Experience would now tell me, watch out. This is part of life. And the sooner we can embrace it and make the most of it. Paul said, I want to stay on in Ephesus. There's a wide door of ministry open to me. But then he added, there are many adversaries. Didn't have to be that there were no adversaries in order for Paul to rejoice in an open door. Sometimes it's the adversaries that open the door wider. It's a really kind of a complicated thought, and don't have time to develop it fully this morning. I read a book not too long ago. I could hardly put it down. It was called Down the Great Unknown. It's by Edward Dornick. A wonderful book if you love to read exciting books. And it's a historical book about the story of man's first extended exploration of the Colorado River. In May of 1869, a ragtag band of 9 mountain men, led by John Wesley Powell, who was a one-armed Civil War veteran, they embarked on the last quest of the American West. You know, Lewis and Clark had gone back in the early 1800s with Jefferson's blessings, but they didn't go down the Grand Canyon or the Colorado River. But like Lewis and Clark, this was to be a journey of discovery, and it was also to be a journey of tragedy. Only 6 of them survived what ended up being, if you can imagine this, a trek of 1,000 miles of rapids over a span of 99 days. White-capped miles. They journeyed in 4 wooden rowboats that if you went to a visitor station with a boat like that and said, I want to go down, they would say, you'll never come back alive. And of course, they had to have their food supplies, and when they left way up north, they had no idea where they were going. They might as well have been going to the moon. Nobody had ever gone down this river. Nobody knew what the Grand Canyon was like, especially from the river, looking upwards. It's just an amazing story. And not only did they go down in these 4 wooden rowboats, but they rowed backwards with their back into the current, careening from one daunting rapids to another. One of their boats got destroyed and their food supplies got soaking wet. And it's just an amazing story, and about guys that were rugged as all get out after fighting through these rapids all day long. When they would come to a little campsite on the side of the river, if they could find one, sometimes the gorge was so tight, then the Powell, their one-armed leader, he would climb the side of the Grand Canyon to make geological explorations. He's got one arm. And I read this story and I said, these are different people than I know of, different than I am. And how they had the fortitude and the stamina to do this is just amazing. And I know about this because I have canoed. My wife and I have been on a couple 3 float trips. Probably the closest we've ever been to divorce in our life. And probably the source of the problem is me. She says, I sit in the back of the canoe barking out orders left and right, and I don't know my right hand from my left hand. I remember those float trips, and she's right. And they never had any rapids, but they almost did us in. Back to our primary text, 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 9. How could Paul say a wide door for effective service had opened to him when he was continually confronted by so many obstacles and so much opposition? How could he say that? The answer lies in the testimony recorded by Paul in 2 Corinthians 11, verses 8 and 9, which are 2 Corinthians 12, verses 8 and 9. Keith, and this is why I might have sometime just let you read the wrong text, but I wanted you to read this one because I wanted to circle back now. And I know it's almost out of vogue to sit around with your family and to memorize scriptures, but I wish we could do that with this one because it's so central to what our life is all about. This comes on the heels of Paul's discussion about his thorn in the flesh, which I really don't think was a physical ailment. I think it was more of a people problem. Adversaries everywhere. And Paul writes to us, and I want us all to memorize this text. However long it takes you, and however you stumble through it, I want you to chew on it and get it in your mind so that even if you have to give a crude translation of the text, you get what it says. You can communicate it to yourself and to your family and to others. I think it's the key to living a life that's filled with faith. So here we go, what Keith read to start. Concerning this, that is, this thorn in the flesh, I entreated the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. Let me pause there and I'll come back and read without interruption. It's okay to pray that God would remove problems from your life. Jesus did that. He prayed 3 times before the cross. Said, Father, if possible, let this cup be taken away. And God said, Jesus said, not my will, but thy will be done. And the Father said, it's my will. You're going to go to the cross. So it's okay to pray about a problem and even to pray 3 times. But at some point, it's also good to say, Lord, whatever your will is. So let's back up and read it without interruption. Concerning this, I entreated the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, Paul writes, therefore I will rather boast about my weaknesses, that the power of Christ might dwell in me. Therefore, Paul summarizes with a flurry here, I am content with weaknesses and with insults and with distresses and with persecutions and difficulties, all of this for Christ's sake, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Because when I'm weak, God comes to give me strength. What a great lesson. What a great lesson. And you'll not make it through life if you don't grasp this lesson. Let's bow in prayer, please.